very close to our hearts as Rotarians. So Stuart has spent the last 43 years volunteering in the NGO sector, that would be non-governmental organization sector, both in New Zealand and internationally, including most South Pacific countries, as well as India, Kenya, Tanzania, Swaziland, and South Africa. He is an honorary consul for the government of Tanzania. He is also currently the executive director of Rotary New Zealand World Community Service. He is also a former board member of New Zealand's Council for International Development. So Eugene Metropolitan Rotary Club, in collaboration with Corvallis Rotary Club and many friends, donated this winter approximately $2,375 US to Rotary New Zealand World Community Service. And that contribution was to help Rotary New Zealand World Community Service in their work on Tongan relief following the eruption of the Hunga Tonga volcano in January 2022. So Stuart is here to talk to us a little bit this evening about that, about their work in Tonga. And of course, we'd be interested in hearing the other work that the organization does around the world. I do also want to acknowledge in welcoming Stuart tonight that he and his fellow Rotarians and friends experienced a significant loss recently with the passing of past District Governor Gordon Hooper in New Zealand. This was a close friend and colleague, and Stuart's been very busy preparing for the service on Monday, which would have happened. So I wanted to acknowledge that. In addition, Stuart tells me that his daughter will be home this week after not seeing her for 3 years due to the pandemic. So he's having a very big week, and we're very fortunate to get him to speak with us this evening. So with all of that introduction, please join me in welcoming Stuart Batty to our club this evening. Stuart, I think you're still muted.
Yes, it is. Yeah, well, thank you very much, Kathy, for that introduction. At the moment, it's just after 1 o'clock tomorrow in terms of America. And this morning, we've enjoyed -3 degrees, so somewhat different to what you'll be having over there, I'm sure. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction. And yes, I was district governor some 31 years ago in actually District 9910. I'm actually in District 9970 at the moment, which next week will become District 9999, would you believe, as we are in fact merging with another district here in New Zealand. So today I've been asked to talk about Tonga and the volcano tsunami, which occurred there on the 15th of January this year. When we talk about these places in the Pacific, you know, you talk about Tonga. Okay, well, what is actually Tonga? Well, it's made up of 169 islands, of which Rotary happens to be domiciled on one of them, so a major task. There are 36 of those islands that actually have inhabitation, but the main island of Tonga Tapu actually has 70% of the population, and there's probably another 10 or 11 that have significant numbers. When I say significant numbers, a few hundred to a few thousand. So another interesting statistic is that if you take all those islands, they would make up around about 750 square kilometres. But overall, Tonga represents something like 700,000 square kilometres within the ocean of the South Pacific. So it's a very well-spread country, as in fact most of them are. You know, I could talk about Fiji, Samoa, and others in the Pacific, and they also have the same things with multiple islands spread over a large percentage of the Pacific Ocean. The population of Tonga is only 100,000 across all those islands. But as I mentioned, 70% live on Tonga Tapu. There's actually 100,000 Tongans who actually live overseas. And the greatest majority, you might be interested to know, live either in Australia or New Zealand or on the west coast of America. There's quite a large population of Tongans on the west coast of America. Interestingly enough, my daughter's from San Francisco, and she's just done some major work on her land over there, and the whole team are actually from Tonga. So that's evidence that they certainly are there. Tonga was originally a British protected state, but it went independent in 1970. But it still has a monarchy, and the monarchy still carry a lot of power with a number of lords appointed by the monarch. They are sort of democratic because they do have elections and elect their politicians and a prime minister. I think it's every 4 years. So it's an interesting country all round. In terms of Rotary, there's one Rotary club in Nuku'alofa, which is the capital of Tonga on the main island of Tonga Tapu. Now, that's a typical Rotary club in some of these Pacific Island countries. The membership fluctuates from 4 to 18, depending on the number of expats that might be based there and other issues. Currently, I understand the membership is around about 14. 2 or 3 years ago, in fact, when I last visited 2 or 3 years ago, it was actually down to 4. There's one particular Rotarian there who's been with the club through thick and thin, and I think at last count he'd been president about 7 times over. So it's in this kind of background that you can gain, you know, exactly where Rotary fits into the situation. So as you obviously read and heard, the volcano erupted on the 15th of January, and that was followed by a tsunami, which swept across, in the main, only 3 islands of those 169 islands. But the 3 islands that actually were covered by the tsunami was pretty devastating. Fortunately, the number of homes that were destroyed was just over 300, but 468 have been declared. That's due to them either being destroyed completely or being severely damaged, 468 to be rebuilt. Now, a home in Tonga can vary. You can have some really, I won't say palatial, but you can have some really good quality homes, as you probably would have in your own state or wherever you come from. But a large majority of them are very, what we would call poor standard. A lot of the people in Tonga and also the other Pacific Islands don't have electricity, for instance, and running water can be an issue for some, and certainly sewerage is generally on septic tank. So it's a pretty humble sort of a place. So they were devastated, as I say, on 3 main islands, and so Rotary, with a number of other NGOs over there, swung into action as soon as they were able. Of course, what you got to remember, again, with every time we have an event in the Pacific, and usually without fail, every summer, or our summer, your winter, there is a severe cyclone. There's usually around about 10 to 12 named cyclones in the Pacific during that period, and usually 1 to 3 cause severe damage. Fortunately, this year, we did have about 4 or 5 named cyclones in the Pacific, but none actually caused any damage. So Rotary New Zealand, for a very long period of time, has been supporting communities in the Pacific. And one thing we do in a very practical way is through what we call an emergency response kit. And this is a kit that is actually made up in New Zealand. And basically what it is that in the event of a cyclone in the main, where a house is completely demolished, this kit basically will provide the basics for people to have those essential items that they need to re-establish their home. What normally happens in a cyclone is, and of course with this tsunami, people are taken to evacuation centres and they stay there until it's safe to return. With a cyclone, quite often they return to very little. We're very proud with our emergency response kits that they're always basically the first practical assistance that people do receive. So these kits are packed in New Zealand, but we have them pre-positioned in a number of countries. Vanuatu on 2 sites, Santo and the capital Port Vila, which again, in a straight line is about 1,000 kilometres between. We have them positioned in Nuku'alofa, Tonga, in Apia and Samoa, and we have them also positioned at 3 main centres in Fiji and also in the Cook Islands. So basically what happens is, in terms of this support, once the event has occurred, our people on the ground there, and they may be Rotarians or they may not be, depending on the strength of the Rotary Club at the particular time. So our people on the ground there immediately contact or are contacted by the Management Disaster Centre, which is set up after these events. And with their collaboration and cooperation, our emergency response kits are distributed. Now, and again, it varies as to who and how they are distributed. In places like Fiji, for instance, where currently we've got around about 175 Rotarians, plus a very large community of supporters. In the main, in Fiji, they are distributed by Rotarians. But in a place like Tonga, where the membership is quite small, we do engage other partners, trusted partners, to do the distribution for us. One thing you've also got to be mindful of, that when there is a cyclone or tsunami, quite often the Rotarians, could be all of them, or certainly a number of them, also lose their homes. So they basically suffer as well as the people that we're there to serve. And in fact, in this case with the tsunami, I know of at least one of the Rotarians who actually lost their home totally. So, you know, it affects Rotarians as well as the people that we're to support. So on this occasion, our trusted partner, Māori Tonga Trust, who in fact house our preposition stock, they, together with the government and also support from the Navy, distributed our emergency response kits within days of the occurrence. So that basically support that the families receive initially. In addition to that, as we started receiving funding into our account here in New Zealand, we remitted some funds to Tonga because they had asked for support to support families with food and other commodities essential to them being able to recover from the event. So that was done. And then, of course, the main thrust of this event was more long term. So the club had determined up there, along with the other NGOs, that any funding received through Rotary, both locally in New Zealand and in Australia, we have Rorks in Australia, does the same as we do, that money would be used for the long-term recovery. So what is the long-term recovery? What's the essential situation? Well, essentially, obviously, there are homes to be rebuilt, and the government itself has pledged, in fact, to support people to, in fact, do that. The biggest impact with the tsunami was the loss of crops, livestock, and the fisheries. And so there's a massive job to be done to rehabilitate land, to replant, and to refence, and all those sorts of things to get food security back to where it was in Tonga prior to the event. So there's 3 islands that were severely impacted. There was the main island of Tonga Tapu, the third largest island, which is called Aiawa, which is spelled E'(UA), and Haiapai, which is spelled HA'(APAI). So they were the 3 islands that got the main, suffered the main damage. So the long-term recovery is being supported by Rotary. We've still got money coming in. In fact, in May, we had the contributions that came into our account in May was quite a record, actually. We received over 100,000, and that's some 5 months since the event. And I think this is normal. When you put out an appeal for Rotary, it's got a very, very, very long tail. And quite often we'll close an appeal, and 6 months later, you're still getting money coming in dribs and drabs. So there we are. So basically, the funding which Rotary's received has been used to supply essential needs. We also, of course, have to replace the emergency response kits. And currently, we do this in the off-season. So currently, we've just leased a warehouse here in Auckland, which we'll have for 3 months. And we set up a plant and basically order all the kits and all the contents in. They're all delivered to the warehouse. They're all set out in a conveyor belt style. And then we have teams of Rotarians go in every night over a period of 6 to 12 weeks to pack the kits. And then they'll be containerized and sent to Tonga to replace those kits. Now that's, I was talking to the manager that I have in Auckland the other day, and we believe that the cost to replace those kits is around about New Zealand, $360,000. So that's quite a big amount that will contribute to the Tongan people, or has contributed to the Tongan people. So we're working with Rotary, and as I say, when you've got a limited number of Rotarians, basically they don't get involved themselves in activities or in projects, but they tend to support other NGOs within their community. But we also work in conjunction with the Rotary Club in Tonga, in particular, with 2 other main NGOs who are local. And one's called Māori Tonga Trust, which I mentioned, and they are very much involved in the rural sector, and they are the main people who will, in fact, rehabilitate the land, in fact, grow the seedlings and plant the crops with the locals, people being involved, and re-establish the farms so that the country returns to having food security and also the ability to export as they have had in the past, which will provide the locals with income. Now, one of the complications with this event, which has really slowed down the process, is the fact that Tonga, for months and months and months, went without COVID. And in fact, they had situations in place where the border was completely shut to the outside world for very, very, very many months. And so COVID was not a problem. In November last year, they allowed a flight in, and in fact, it actually went up from Christchurch direct to Tonga. So they allowed one of the first flights in, and sure enough, there was somebody on that flight who had COVID. And very soon after that, COVID started to spread around Tonga. And they've had a number, I've not looked at the latest number of cases, and it doesn't sound large by comparison with America or New Zealand or elsewhere, but they were hitting, they're currently somewhere between 10 and 20,000 cases of COVID. And the border, to a large extent, is still shut to visitors. And in fact, if I went up there next week, I would be allowed in, but I would have to go into isolation. So this has had a terrible impact on the rate of recovery, and also has impacted on the ability of not only Rotary, but our trusted partners to get on with the job. But there are signs, like there is elsewhere in the world, that we're reaching a stage which we call after COVID, and therefore we'll be able to finish the job that we've set out to do. Now, I haven't got a watch on, and I haven't been watching the time, so if someone thinks I've probably spoken long enough, put up their hand, and I'll leave it there and maybe answer questions.
That sounds great, Stuart. Thank you. Yeah, so let's maybe open the floor to questions, both from the folks out in the virtual space and those of us here at the Davis. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we'll try to spot you. Anybody here have a question? I certainly have some questions. So maybe I'm gonna jump in and start out. Stuart, the agriculture situation, as you said, the fallout, the ash fall, I understand from the volcano eruption, and that it was both very fine ash as well as pebbles, which sort of really destroyed the crops and created big problems for the water supply. What is realistic for replanting? And you know, you mentioned, it sounds like Modi and Tonga will play the key role there, but in assisting locals with that process. But how soon is that likely to happen?
Well, in fact, it's rather strange, but in fact, the ash itself is actually good for the land. And in fact, it's got qualities of being a very good fertilizer for not only the immediate future, but for years to come. So there is no real issue there. It's just a matter of clearing the debris, which I think probably has been done. But, you know, obviously the tsunami just took away in the rural areas, trees and shrubs and fences and all sorts of things of that nature. So there was a massive clear up of debris. And then, of course, from then on, the land could be rehabilitated. They do have, unlike places that I visit in Africa, they do have machinery up there, tractors and plows and all that sort of thing. So that's not a big issue to them. The main issue really would be to reinstate the shade houses, and they've got some massive shade houses up there. Maori have on both the main island and the other islands, shade houses where they set the seeds and grow plants and whatever. So they've all had to be rebuilt, and then obviously seeds and things have to have been imported, planted, and but they're well on the way in that regard. So now the land rehabilitation will take time, but you know, on the other hand, I'm told anyway that the ash has actually been a good thing for the soil. So there we are. I haven't heard too much about the stones, so I don't think they would be an issue. But in fact, a lot of the Pacific Island countries anyway, the ground is very, very stony, and it is here in Christchurch, in fact, and we see that as a good thing for growing vegetables and the like, because it keeps the soils aerated.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. How about if we take questions first from Dan Reese, then Jerry Harris, then Paul and Laura Shong, and then we'll see who else. Dan?
Yeah, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Stuart, for both joining us this evening, but also for giving us the opportunity to partner with you in your efforts to provide relief to Tonga. My questions, just two, both related to COVID. I was wondering, you've already addressed some of the challenges that COVID has posed for the relief efforts, but could you speak to the degree to which Tonga has access to the vaccine and the vaccination rates there? I'm also kind of curious about what the current situation is with COVID in New Zealand and your vaccination rates there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's talk about New Zealand first. We rightly or wrongly shut COVID out of New Zealand from day one. Huge restrictions here on the population. The country was shut down, and the government believed, in particular, members of government believed that we were going to be a light to the world and COVID would never come here and that sort of thing. Regrettably, we in the last 2 months have moved into a phase whereby COVID is very much high on the agenda. At one stage, within the last 2 months, we were getting 10 to 20,000 cases a day. And that's reported cases. So basically, my view is that you probably could double that. So currently, we're getting between 5,000 and 10,000 cases a day. When that will dissipate completely, who knows? I compare New Zealand with New South Wales. Now, New South Wales in Australia opened up their borders and what have you probably 6 months ago. But since that time, they have been having between 10 and 20,000 cases a day. I'm not sure what the current situation is, but they're still having significant numbers. It's very interesting with this COVID thing because, and of course, pressures come on the politicians up until last night, or in fact, I think yesterday morning. If you'd, like my daughter came in last week, and in fact, I was talking to somebody at the funeral, it was mentioned on Monday, who'd actually come in on Sunday night. Now, up until the last flight on Sunday night, you had to have a pre-test before you actually got on the plane. And then when you arrived here, you have to have a test on day 1, test on day 5. But pressure from politicians or pressure on politicians saw that suddenly cancelled with 48 hours notice. So people who came in on Sunday night had to go through that. People who came in on Monday night, no longer. So, and interestingly enough, this is when COVID is probably, the rates of COVID are higher than they've ever been. So it's quite interesting how this thing's evolved around the world. Now, in terms of the islands, Tonga and vaccination rates, my understanding is that the rates in Tonga are not as high as they should be, but there have been significant progress. The problem you've got, of course, with these countries, as I mentioned, you've got 36 islands that have got people living on them. So to get the whole population covered is a big challenge. If you look at Fiji, just briefly, Fiji went the other way. The Prime Minister of Fiji determined that they would basically, there'd be no shutdown. Obviously, vaccination was high on the order. And in fact, Fiji were given, this population of Fiji is 900,000. And basically, they were given by New Zealand. New Zealand, very early in the piece, gave away a couple of million vaccines to Fiji and other countries. Australia did the same, and other countries as well. So Fiji finished up with more vaccines than they'd ever need. If they gave everybody 3 or 4, they had more than enough. So basically, they went the other way. They didn't put on restrictions or have curfews or lockdowns, and so they had quite a significant number of deaths, 500 or 600 deaths in quick succession. But with high vaccination rates, they were able to open up the country very, very quickly. And in fact, in December and January of just past, you couldn't actually get a bed in Fiji if you were coming in as a tourist, because their tourism had been reopened. And the same occurs now. Fiji is really back into business. Whereas we in New Zealand, we're still not getting visitors because there's this fear of coming into New Zealand. Well, first of all, there's the restrictions, I think, which was holding back a lot of people. And then there's the fear now that if you come here, you're likely to pick it up and take it home with you. It was interesting. I recently came back from Tanzania in Africa, and the flight from Dubai to Auckland landed in Kuala Lumpur, and we offloaded about 50 passengers, and they changed the crew, and we were supposed to be sitting on the ground for an hour and a half. The new crew came on board. Within minutes, the captain came on and said, as soon as refueling's finished, we're off. He said, we'll get away from here about an hour early. He said, can you believe it? Nobody's got on here to go to New Zealand. And I think, that's been typical of the situation here. So our country's suffering very much at this point in time, lack of tourists and what have you. And I think it's going to be many months before we actually do recover, as a lot of the countries around the world are.
Thank you, Stuart. Our next question is from Jerry Harris.
Stuart, thank you for your talk. I'm wondering if, you mentioned it early on that there, one of the next big jobs is rebuilding there and funding rebuilding. And when we have natural disasters here, I'm thinking most particularly of floods, there's always a discussion about whether you should allow rebuilding in the places that are prone to flooding and should have never been built there in the first place. And I'm sort of wondering if the regulatory environment in Tonga is having those discussions now.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Basically, very early in the piece, the government said that on one of those outer islands where villages had been wiped out, that the people would be relocated to Tonga Tapu, and they would be built homes on Tonga Tapu, and that the other islands, they were not fit for purpose for reinstating communities. Yes, so that's been done to a very large extent on this occasion. Regrettably, with cyclones that go through the Pacific, particularly in places like Vanuatu and Fiji to some extent, although things have improved there rapidly in recent times. Basically, a place gets blown over, they recover what timber and iron they can, they rebuild it for it to be blown over the next time. But things have changed. We've got, our motto in Rotary is build back better. And in fact, in Fiji in particular, Rotary's been involved in building schools, and in fact the whole community, if you go onto the website and you look up Korea Pita, we've actually built a village in Fiji, something like 279 homes there, which are going to go to probably 350 to 400 homes. Now, the last severe cyclone in Tonga, in Fiji, all around this village, places were just blown away. But in the village, there was a retaining wall, only a few feet of a retaining wall came down. Not one house suffered any damage. And in fact, I can on another island, there was a school, and I visited this school, and there was the main school block, huge school block, probably 8 or 9 classrooms, built by the government. There was a very large toilet block alongside, built by Rotary, and then at one end there was a preschool built by Rotary. And a big cyclone went through, completely demolished the classrooms, but left the toilet block and the preschool standing. And in fact, the Prime Minister, Bainimarama, he went on radio and TV saying, we must start building our communities like Rotary builds some of the units and things that they do in New Zealand. So yeah, there is an awareness of in the Pacific to build back better, and certainly in Tonga, the government stepped in very early and said, we're going to shift whole communities here.
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Paul, you're up next.
Okay, well, very quickly, Stuart, I want to thank you for your talk. And I just wanted to make one brief comment, and it's not a rant, but just a comment, that it felt much safer in terms of social distancing and masking in Mexico, where I've been for the past month, than here in the United States. So take that for what it's worth. Finally, I just wanted to ask you very quickly, the way to send money to support the relief projects efforts is again posted on your club website. Is that correct? Is it still there?
That's correct. Yeah. Things, the world moves very, very quickly. We have received substantial funding for Tonga, as have our friends Rotary Australia World Community Service. We actually talk with them about twice a month on Zoom. We work together. We've got substantial fundings both in Australia and here. Things do move, so our main thrust at the moment, whilst we're still accepting funding for Tonga, our main thrust here now has moved to Ukraine, in fact. And Rotary Australia World Community Services that launched their appeal. And when I last looked, both our organisations, because of the nature of how we're structured, not only do we get support from Rotarians, individual Rotarians, also Rotary clubs, but we also get a lot of support from our governments and from the general public. So our friends in Australia to date, I think they've now passed 5 million Australian dollars in their Ukraine appeal. We've probably, when you compare populations, we're probably not doing quite as well, but certainly we're having an impact. And we've actually partnered both here in Australia with the local Ukraine associations to help with that effort. Yeah. So, things move on. Of course, in Australia, they've had the floods, they've had the bushfires, and they've had, the floods and the bushfires. And in fact, they've also had cyclones there as well. So we do also support our immediate neighbours.
Stuart, I'd like to just echo the thanks to you for taking time out of your schedule to come and be with us virtually here in Eugene, Oregon, and really express great appreciation for all the work that you're doing. We've heard mostly about the Pacific Islands, but I know that Rotary New Zealand World Community Service is doing work in several countries in Africa as well. So huge thanks to you for your ongoing work, and very much appreciation for that.
Thank you for that. Yes, we also, I'd like to thank you and say how much we appreciate the support that we have received from you and from our fellow Rotarians right across the world. As you mentioned, Rotary New Zealand has had a connection with Africa for many years, and in particular Tanzania. And Rotary, I can assure you, Rotary in Africa is booming. I was over there only 3 or 4 weeks ago and visited Tanzania and Uganda, and the Rotary clubs districts over there are booming, so much so that they're unlike New Zealand, where we're combining districts, they're actually splitting districts. And I went to a Rotary conference there in Arusha in Tanzania. There were 780 registrations, 600 from Uganda, 180 from Tanzania. Very few grey hair. Very few with grey hair. If you come to New Zealand, there's very few with dark hair. But it really is good to see how Rotary is progressing in Africa, and long may it continue. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We know it's very late where you are.